The most dangerous lies were the ones that smelled like home. Lottie had spent 23 years believing that lavender and wood smoke meant safety. Her mother had dried lavender bundles every autumn, hanging them from the kitchen rafters until the whole cottage breathed purple and soft. Even after her mother died, even after her father remarried and the cottage stopped feeling like hers. The smell still meant, hold on. You are not alone. She should have known better. Lavender could grow over graves just as easily as over gardens. The mating ceremony of Ashford Pack had been arranged with extraordinary care. That was the first sign Lottie had ignored. Her stepmother, Myron, had pressed the ivory dress herself, had threaded ribbon through Lottie's dark hair with patient hands, had looked at her in the mirror with something that resembled pride. For one unguarded moment, Lottie had let herself feel it, that warmth, that hope that maybe the years of distance between them had finally begun to close. She is just nervous for you, Lottie had told herself. She wants you well matched, that is all. The ceremony ground was lit with 100 torches. Late autumn had stripped the oaks bare, and their skeletal arms reached overhead like witnesses. The air smelled of pine resin and cold earth, and the particular sharpness of wolf gathering. Something between iron and rain. Lottie had stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling the grass through the thin soles of her slippers, watching the other unmated women move in clusters, laughing, adjusting their hair, pretending not to scan every male face that passed. She had not scanned faces, she had waited. Edmund had promised. That was the second sign she had ignored. The fact that a promise from Edmund Voss felt like enough. Edmund, who was handsome and laughed easily, and had grown up 2 valleys over, whose father held a minor lordship within the pack. Edmund, who had taken her hand at the last harvest gathering, and said, "I will find you at the ceremony, Lottie. I will find you first." She had carried those words for 3 months like a pressed flower kept between pages, fragile, private, occasionally taken out to be looked at. She stood alone at the edge of the torchlight. Around her, the ceremony proceeded in its ancient rhythm. The alpha of Ashford Pack, Lord Gregor, moved through the crowd with his bonded mate on his arm, acknowledging pairs as they formed. A low ceremonial drumbeat anchored the night. Somewhere near the fire circle, a woman laughed and was silenced by a kiss. The scent of completed bonds was beginning to thread through the cold air. Something warm, golden, like bread and honey and relief. Lottie crossed her arms over her chest and told herself he was simply late. She told herself that for a long time. It was her own nose that finally betrayed her. She had always been told her senses were unusually sharp for someone with no wolf, a peculiarity, the pack healer had called it, a sensitivity. It had never been useful before. It had only ever meant she could smell things she did not wish to smell, know things she was not meant to know. Tonight, it showed her Edmund. He was not late. He was 40 feet away, half hidden behind the old willow at the far edge of the ceremony ground, and he was not alone. The woman with him was taller than Lottie, golden-haired, wearing green, and the way his hands held her face was not the way a man touched a stranger. That was not a greeting. That was not coincidence. That was not something that had just begun tonight. Lottie did not move. She felt the cold of the grass through her slippers travel slowly up through her calves, her knees, her chest, until it reached her throat and stopped there. She watched Edmund laugh against the golden woman's temple. She watched him wipe a smear of something. Candle wax. Paint. She would never know. From the woman's jaw with his thumb. The way a man touches a face he has touched 1,000 times. 3 months. She had kept his words like a pressed flower. She turned away before he could see her. That much, at least, she managed. She turned and moved back through the crowd with careful steps, keeping her spine straight, keeping her face arranged into something that was not grief, because grief required an audience, and she refused to give this place one. She moved toward the outer edge of the ceremony ground, past knots of people she half recognized, past servants carrying trays of spiced cider, past 2 young wolves who were circling each other with the delirious distraction of new recognition. She reached the outer torches and kept walking. The cold sharpened past the firelight. The sounds of the ceremony softened. She walked without direction, into the dark between trees, and when she was certain no one could see her, she sat down on a stone wall that marked the edge of Lord Gregor's estate and pressed her palms flat against the cold rock and breathed. You knew, she thought. Some part of you always knew. That was perhaps the worst of it. She had never fully believed in Edmund. She had only wanted to, very badly, because the alternative was spending another season alone in her father's house, under Marin's careful architecture of quiet cruelty. She had wanted Edmund to be true, because she was tired of having nothing to hold. She sat on the stone wall in her ivory dress and let the cold settle around her like a second skin. She did not cry. She was past the crying stage, she thought. She had cried at 15 when her father had first brought Marin home. She had cried at 18 when she realized the pack considered her less because she had no wolf shift. She had cried at 20 when her younger brother Cale had been sent away. Marin's suggestion, softly voiced, thoroughly executed. The boy needs a proper education among his own kind, doesn't he? It is for his benefit. Cale's letters had stopped arriving 8 months ago. Lottie pressed her palms harder against the stone. She was not going to cry over Edmund Voss. She heard them before she understood what she was hearing. 2 voices, low and quick, coming from the other side of the wall, a gap in the estate hedge, some back pathway used by servants or guards. She stilled instinctively, her peculiar senses, never controllable, sharpened on their own. By the end of the season, Marin says, the girl will be 24 and unmated. Once Gregor formally marks her as unclaimed by the pack, she loses the protection and the property. The Eastern Valley land, the mill, that goes to Marin. The father signed it 3 years ago. He just doesn't know the rest. A pause. The scrape of a boot on stone. The rest, meaning the girl. Edmund was supposed to bond her, keep her occupied. Marin needed a year, maybe 2. But Edmund's been sniffing after the Vance girl since spring, and Marin, she's done waiting. The powder is already arranged, slow, looks like fever. The cold was no longer outside her. It was inside her ribcage now, moving through every hollow space in her chest. Powder. Slow. Looks like fever. Lottie did not breathe. She sat perfectly still on the stone wall and understood that the lavender had always been a lie, and that her stepmother had not sewn her into this ivory dress out of something resembling pride, but out of the particular patience of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to finish something she had already started. She thought of the tea Marin had pressed on her this morning. For your nerves, darling. You'll want to be calm tonight. She had drunk half of it before setting it aside. Her hands had been slightly unsteady all evening. She had attributed it to anticipation. Slow. Looks like fever. She got off the wall. Her legs were not entirely steady. She did not let herself think about that. She moved away from the voices, back toward the ceremony ground, then past it, past the outer ring of torches, into the dark lane that led toward the road. Her mind was working in a cold, stripped-down way that felt almost like calm, except for the way her pulse was hammering at the base of her throat. She needed to get away from this estate. She needed to get somewhere she could think, somewhere Marin could not find her until she understood the full shape of what was being done to her. She needed Cale, and the thought of Cale, his letters gone silent, his absence that Marin had arranged so carefully, made her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with whatever was in her blood. What had Marin done with Cale? The lane was dark and deeply rutted from carriage wheels. Lottie walked quickly, her slippers wholly inadequate, her ivory dress a foolish beacon in the blackness. She was perhaps a quarter mile from the estate gates when she heard it. The sound of a horse party, more than one, moving fast on the road ahead. She stepped off the lane into the hedge shadow and waited. The horses slowed. They were large animals, dark, ridden by men in traveling cloaks that bore no marking she recognized, 5 riders. The one at the front was bigger than the others, not in the exaggerated way of men who wanted to seem powerful, but in the settled, inevitable way of someone who simply was. He had not drawn a weapon. He was not looking at the tree line the way a threat looked. He was looking directly at her, in the shadows of the hedge, in her ivory dress, on a dark autumn lane, somehow. He had already seen her. His horse stopped without him visibly commanding it. The other riders stopped behind him. He looked at her for a long moment, unhurried, thorough, entirely calm. And something about the quality of that attention made the hair on her arms rise under her sleeves. "You are alone," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and even and carried in the cold air without effort. "That is my business," Lottie said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Barely. He looked at her dress. He looked at the direction she had come from, the distant torchlight of the ceremony still visible above the tree line. He looked back at her face. "You came from the Ashford ceremony." Still not a question. "I was leaving it." On foot. Alone. At night. A pause. In ceremony dress. She said nothing. She was aware that she was cold and slightly unsteady and probably pale, and that her hands had not entirely stopped trembling since the wall, and that she was standing in a hedgerow on a dark lane having a conversation with a stranger on horseback, when there were people behind her who had been discussing the best way to make her death look natural. He swung down from his horse in a single unhurried movement. He was very tall. Even 3 feet away, even in the dark, the quality of his presence was not subtle. It was not threat. It was something else. The particular gravity of someone accustomed to being the fixed point in a room, the weight that everything else organized itself around. He looked at her, and she had the disorienting sensation that he was not just seeing her face, that he was seeing something underneath it. "What is your name?" he said. She should not tell him. She knew she should not tell him. She was a woman alone on a dark road who had just discovered her stepmother was poisoning her, and this man was a stranger with 5 armed riders behind him, but her legs were beginning to shake and the cold had reached her fingertips, and somewhere behind her was an estate full of people who did not know or did not care that she was in danger, and this man had stopped his horse. "Lottie," she said. Something moved through his expression. Quick, controlled, almost immediately gone. "Lottie," he repeated, then, very quietly, as though saying something that had already been decided. "My name is Leander." She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. The cold in her chest and the name in the air arrived at the same moment, and the combination was almost enough to take her off her feet. Leander. Alpha King Leander. The name settled over the dark lane like a second silence. Lottie had heard it spoken in the way people spoke of weather or war. Things that were real but distant. Forces that shaped the world without requiring her to think about them directly. The Alpha King ruled 7 packs across the Northern Territories. He had ended the border conflicts 3 years ago with methods that no one described in detail, but everyone referenced in tone. He was, depending on who was speaking, either the most dangerous man alive, or the only reason the packs had not torn each other apart entirely. He was standing 4 feet in front of her on a dark lane, and she was wearing a ceremonial dress and shaking. "You should sit down," he said. "I am fine." He looked at her hands. She became aware of them again, the slight, persistent tremor she had been trying to ignore since the wall. She pressed them together in front of her, which helped nothing. "You are not fine," he said, with the particular neutrality of someone reporting a fact rather than offering an opinion. He did not say it cruelly. He did not say it with pity. He simply said it the way a man said it is raining when it was raining. "How long have you been symptomatic?" Her chin came up. "I don't know what you mean. Your hands, the pallor. You are cold past what the temperature accounts for." He was still watching her with that quality of attention that felt almost invasive in its steadiness. "Something is moving through your system that should not be there." She said nothing. He did not press. He turned back toward his riders and said something low in a language she did not recognize, and one of them, a leaner man with a scar crossing his jaw, dismounted and opened one of the travel packs at his horse's flank. He brought something forward, a small, dark flask. Leander took it without looking away from her. He held it out. "It will slow whatever is in you," he said. "It will not undo it, but it will slow it." Lottie looked at the flask. She looked at him. The irony was not lost on her that she was standing here trying to decide whether to trust a stranger's flask, when it was a trusted woman's cup that had started this. "I don't know you," she said. "No. I have no reason to trust you." Also true. "Then why would I?" "Because," he said with the same calm, "the alternative is that whatever is in your blood continues unchecked through the night, and you are found in the morning by people who arrange for it to be there." He paused. "That is what happened, is it not?" It was not a question. He already knew, or he had read it from her face, from her dress, from her walking alone down a dark lane from a ceremony that should have been full of people who cared where she was. She did not know which. Both possibilities were unsettling. She took the flask. She drank. It tasted of copper and something herbal, bitter, with a faint sweetness underneath that her body seemed to recognize before her mind did. The trembling in her hands did not stop, but within a few minutes it became less insistent. The ice at the base of her throat receded slightly. She handed the flask back. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had raised her to say thank you, regardless of circumstances. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, quickly contained. "You are welcome," he said. Behind him, his riders had not moved, had not spoken, had not shown anything other than the disciplined stillness of men long accustomed to waiting. The horses breathed steam into the cold air. The distant torchlight from the ceremony continued its indifferent glow above the tree line. "Where were you going?" Leander asked. "Away. From the ceremony. From the estate." She looked at the road ahead, dark, unfamiliar past the first quarter-mile. She had not thought further than away. She had not had a plan beyond removing herself from Marin's reach before she understood the full shape of the thing. "I need to find somewhere I can think." On foot. In that dress. With something in your blood. She pressed her lips together. She knew how it sounded. She knew it sounded like a woman with no plan, and no resources standing in the dark and calling it strategy. She did not need him to enumerate it for her. "I did not have time to prepare," she said, more sharply than she intended. "No," he agreed, without judgment. "You had time to run," which was the correct choice. "Preparation comes after." She looked at him. The quality of that sentence, the way it restructured what she had done from foolish flight into correct tactical decision, was not what she had expected from anyone, let alone him. "My party has a camp 2 miles east," he said. "It is warm. It is guarded, and you would be safe for the night. In the morning, when you are steadier, you can decide what you want to do next." He held her gaze. "You are not obligated to trust me. But the offer is made. She should say no." Every instinct built from 23 years of being burned by offered hands was telling her to say no. That trust was a room she had entered too many times, only to find it locked from the outside. Leander was a stranger. He was powerful and unknown, and she was already compromised, already unsteady, already holding the flask of a man she could not verify. But he had not moved toward her. He had not lowered his voice to something falsely intimate. He had not smiled in the way men smiled when they wanted something. He had stood at a respectful distance and spoken to her like someone who expected her to make her own decisions. She thought of the voices over the wall. "The powder is already arranged." She thought of Marin's hands threading ribbon through her hair this morning. She thought of Cale. 8 months of silence. 2 miles east, she said. "Yes." "And in the morning, I am free to go where I choose." "Yes." She looked at him for another moment, reading his face for the tells she had learned to look for. The flicker of impatience behind courtesy. The slight recalibration of posture, when a woman asked for something that would be granted, and then quietly rescinded. The way a man looked at a woman he already considered his. She found none of those things. She found stillness and a directness that did not flinch from being examined. "All right," she said. He nodded once, not with satisfaction, just acknowledgement, and turned to speak to the scarred rider, who brought a horse forward. Not a grand gesture, not a ceremony, a practical arrangement. The ride to camp was quiet. Lottie sat behind one of the junior riders. Leander had offered his own horse, and she had declined, and he had accepted her refusal without comment, which she noted, and watched the dark tree line pass, and tried to organize her thoughts into something usable. The shape of what Marin had done was becoming clearer the longer she turned it over. 3 years ago, her father had signed something, the Eastern Valley land, the mill. She had been 12 when her mother died, and 15 when Marin arrived, and she had never thought to ask what documents accompanied a remarriage in a pack household, had never thought to look at what her father's signature could be made to mean with the right arrangement of paperwork around it. She had been too busy grieving, and then too busy surviving, and Marin had been patient. Marin had known how to wait. Edmund had been part of it. That particular pain had already gone cold. There had not been enough warmth there to leave a lasting burn, but the shape of his role clarified now. Keep Lottie occupied. Keep her hoping. Keep her in place through a season or two, while Marin finished what she had started. Edmund had not even done her the courtesy of being a good actor. She had simply been too willing to believe. And Cale. That was where the cold in her chest had settled and refused to move. Her brother was 20 years old, and somewhere she did not know, and his letters had stopped, and Marin had been the one to arrange his departure, and Lottie was no longer willing to assume coincidence. The camp materialized out of the dark. A serious, functional arrangement of tents and fire pits, guards at measured intervals, horses stabled in a temporary rope enclosure. It was not luxurious. It was organized, disciplined, and warm. A woman she had not seen before, older, gray-streaked hair, an efficiency about her movements, appeared from one of the larger tents and looked at Lottie with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to receiving damaged things and determining what they required. "This is Essa," Leander said. "She will see to your comfort tonight." "You make it sound like a transaction," Lottie said, before she could decide whether to say it. He looked at her. The almost smile again. "What would you prefer I call it?" She had no answer. She was tired and unsteady, and the flask's effect was holding, but she could feel the edges of it. The thing in her blood patient underneath, waiting. She let Essa lead her toward the tent. She stopped at the entrance and looked back. Leander had not followed. He was standing where she'd left him, speaking quietly with the scarred rider, not watching her. And yet she had the distinct impression, unreasonable, probably the fever, that he was aware of exactly where she was. Inside the tent, there was a low pallet with wool blankets, a wash basin, and a small brazier pushing out steady heat. Essa left without asking unnecessary questions, which Lottie appreciated more than she could say. She sat on the edge of the pallet and pressed her hands flat on her knees and let the warmth begin to work. She would not sleep. That was what she told herself. She would think through everything, build a map of what she knew and what she needed to find out, and she would be clear and rational and prepared for morning. She was asleep within 10 minutes. She did not dream of Edmund, or of Marin, or even of the ceremony. She dreamed of a wolf standing at the edge of a forest, enormous, dark-coated, absolutely still, watching her with eyes that were not animal. When she woke, the brazier was freshly stoked. Someone had been in the tent while she slept, and had ensured she was warm, and had done it without waking her, and had left without taking anything. She lay still for a moment, looking at the tent ceiling, and felt the peculiar, terrible sensation of having been cared for by a stranger, and not knowing yet whether that was the beginning of safety or the beginning of something worse. Morning came gray and cold, with the smell of wood smoke and frost-bitten pine threading through the tent canvas. Lottie lay still for exactly 30 seconds after waking, long enough to remember everything, to feel the weight of it settle back onto her chest like a stone placed with deliberate care. Then she sat up. Her hands were steadier, not entirely still, but the fine, persistent tremor from the night before had reduced itself to something she could ignore. Whatever had been in Marin's tea was still moving through her. She could feel it. A low, muffled wrongness behind her sternum, like a bruise on the inside, but it was slower now, contained. She needed a healer. She needed information. She needed to find Cale. She needed, she thought with a flat kind of clarity, to stop needing things and start acquiring them. Essa appeared at the tent entrance with water for washing and a set of clothes that were plain but clean. A dark wool dress, long-sleeved, practical, belonging to someone with broader shoulders than Lottie but close enough. A pair of proper boots. Lottie accepted them without asking where they had come from, because the ivory ceremony dress was not a garment in which she intended to negotiate anything. "The Alpha King asks if you will join him for the morning meal," Essa said, folding the ivory dress over her arm with the neutral efficiency of someone who had been asked to dispose of stranger things. Lottie looked at the tent entrance. Outside, she could hear the camp moving. Quiet, organized, the sounds of a traveling party that knew its own rhythms. "It is a request?" she said. "Not a summons?" Essa's expression did not change. "He said to tell you there is no obligation." "Then yes," Lottie said. "I will join him." He was seated at a camp table near the largest fire pit, a map spread open beside his plate, a cup held loosely in one hand. He looked exactly as he had in the dark, settled, unhurried, taking up exactly the space he occupied and no more. In the morning light he was more legible. Dark hair, strong-featured, somewhere in the later part of his third decade if she had to guess, the kind of face that had been arranged by time and decision rather than simply given. There was a faint scar along his jaw on the left side that she had not seen in the dark. He looked up when she approached. He did not stand. She was glad of that. It would have felt like theater. But he gestured to the opposite chair, with a straightforwardness that she found easier to navigate than courtesy would have been. She sat. Essa brought her food, bread, hard cheese, something hot in a clay cup that smelled of ginger and black pepper, and made the wrongness behind her sternum recede another fraction. "You slept," he said. "Apparently." She wrapped both hands around the cup. You had the brazier restoked. The temperature dropped. I noticed that someone had been in the tent. Essa, he said, not me. She looked at him. He met her gaze without adjustment, without the slight recalibration she had learned to expect from men who were lying or who felt they deserved less scrutiny than they were receiving. I would not enter a woman's tent without her knowledge, he said, with the particular flatness of someone stating a principle, rather than seeking credit for it. Not for any reason. She believed him. She was not sure yet whether that was good judgment or the residue of desperation, but she believed him. She drank from the cup. The ginger moved through her like a small fire, careful and deliberate. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. Last night. On the road. She set the cup down. You already knew something was wrong before I told you anything. You knew about the powder, or you suspected. How? He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of evasion, but of someone deciding how much context was necessary. I was not at Lord Gregor's estate by chance, he said. I have been watching the Ashford Pack's Southern Territory for 3 months. There are land transfers happening that require my attention. Falsified documentation, inheritance manipulation, at least 2 cases of deliberate removal of rightful heirs from pack protection. He looked at her steadily. Your stepmother's name appeared in those documents twice. The bread in Lottie's hand sat untouched. You knew about Marin, she said. I knew about her activities. I did not know about you specifically until last night. Something moved through his expression. Brief, controlled. I should have moved sooner. I did not anticipate the ceremony as a timeline. She processed that. The implication was not small, that Leander had been building a case against Marin for months, that what had happened to Lottie was part of a larger pattern, that she was not the only one who had been moved like a piece on a board by her stepmother's patient, methodical hands. How many others? She asked. 3 that I can confirm. 2 unmated women from neighboring territories who lost pack protection under similar circumstances, and whose properties subsequently transferred to connected parties. He paused. One of them did not survive the process. The cold came back. Lottie set the bread down. And Cale, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. My brother. He was sent away 8 months ago. His letters stopped. I need to know. We are looking for him. She stared. You are already... His name is in the documents. He was removed as a complicating factor. A young male with a legitimate blood claim on the property is a liability to someone trying to clear the inheritance line. He held her gaze. We have a location we are working to confirm. I did not want to tell you until I was certain. Lottie put both hands flat on the table. She needed the solidity of it. She needed something that did not move beneath her hands, while the rest of the world rearranged itself into shapes she had not known to expect. Cale was not simply gone. He had been placed somewhere. He was a complicating factor, which meant he was alive enough to complicate things. She held on to that. Tell me what you know, she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by it. He told her. It took the better part of an hour, and he told it plainly, without softening the difficult parts or dramatizing them, laying the information out in the careful, sequential way of someone who had assembled it piece by piece and understood its weight. Marin had been operating within Ashford Pack's territory, with the quiet cooperation of 2 of Lord Gregor's lesser council members, men who received a percentage of the transferred properties in exchange for ensuring that documentation moved without scrutiny. Her father, Lottie's father, Edmund's intended father-in-law, had signed the original land transfer documents 3 years ago, under the impression that he was providing for his new wife's security. He did not know what the second set of documents said. He possibly did not know his daughter had been poisoned at a ceremony he had not attended, because Marin had told him Lottie preferred he didn't come. That particular detail landed somewhere very specific inside Lottie's chest. Her father had not come because Marin had told him not to, and he had listened. He had listened to Marin over his own daughter's ceremony, and somewhere in the gap between the man her father had been and the man he had become in 15 years of Marin's patient reshaping, Lottie had stopped expecting anything different, which was perhaps the saddest thing about all of it. Your father is not complicit, Leander said, reading something in her face. He has been managed. There is a difference. Is there? She said. In terms of culpability, yes. In terms of outcome for you, I understand why the distinction feels insufficient. She looked at him. The precision of that sentence, acknowledging both the legal and the emotional truth without collapsing one into the other, was not what she expected from an Alpha King discussing pack politics over breakfast. "You are not what I expected," she said, before she had decided to say it. "What did you expect?" "Someone who told me what to feel about it." He was quiet for a moment. "I have no interest in telling you what to feel." She looked away, out past the camp perimeter to where the frost-stiffened grass met the tree line. The sky was the particular white-gray of late autumn, the kind of sky that promised nothing. She thought about the months she had spent managing her own responses, calibrating her grief to what Marin found acceptable, her anger to what her father's peace required, her hope to what Edmund's careless promises could plausibly support. Nobody had asked her what she actually felt in a very long time. She was not going to cry at Leander's camp table. She decided that firmly and moved on. "What happens now?" she said. "That depends on what you want. I want Marin held accountable. I want those council members exposed. I want the land transfers reversed and the documentation corrected." She met his gaze. "And I want my brother back." He nodded slowly, not with surprise, as though he had been waiting to see which direction she would move, toward shelter or toward action, and had now received his answer. "All of that is possible," he said. "But it requires your participation. You are the rightful heir. Your testimony, your identification of the documents, your formal complaint to the Pack Council, these are necessary. I can provide authority and resources. I cannot provide your voice. I understand that. It will also require you to remain under my protection while it is arranged. You are still carrying something in your blood, and Marin will know by this morning that you did not come home. She will begin to move." Lottie thought about that, remaining under his protection. What that meant practically, traveling with his party, operating within his structure, being seen as a woman associated with the Alpha King's movements. There was nothing improper about it, technically. He had riders, attendants, Essa. It was a practical arrangement, and yet she was aware of the way the camp's guards had looked at her this morning. Not with disrespect, but with a particular attentiveness that suggested they had been told she was a priority. She was aware that the brazier had been restoked. She was aware that the clothes had fit well enough to have been chosen by someone who had looked at her carefully. She was aware, if she was being entirely honest with herself, that Leander had looked at her on that dark road with the particular quality of someone recognizing something. Not just a woman in distress, not just a complicating element in his investigation, something more specific than that. She was not ready to examine that. She filed it away in the part of her mind reserved for things that required more stability before they could be safely handled. "All right," she said. "I will stay." He nodded. "I have one condition," she added. "Name it." "I am not a guest here. I am not someone being kept safe while men do the important work." She looked at him directly. "I see the documents. I am told what is planned before it is executed. I am consulted, not informed after the fact." Something in his expression shifted. Something that was almost, she thought, respect. "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. She picked up the bread. She ate. The fire crackled beside them, and the frost began to lift off the grass, and somewhere in a location that was being confirmed, her brother was alive, and she was going to find him. She did not notice precisely the way Leander's gaze returned to her face at intervals throughout the meal. Steady, quiet, carrying a weight she was not yet equipped to name. She noticed almost everything. She was choosing not to notice that. They found Cale 4 days later. The location Leander's men had been confirming turned out to be a working estate 40 miles northeast of Ashford territory. A property belonging to a minor lord named Ashvane, who had accepted a financial arrangement from Marin in exchange for housing one young wolf of no particular status, keeping him fed and supervised and entirely unable to send correspondence. Not a prison, technically. The kind of arrangement that existed in the gray space between detention and disappearance. The kind that left no documentation sharp enough to prosecute cleanly. Cale was alive. He was thinner than Lottie remembered, and there was a wariness in his eyes that had not been there before. A new habit of checking the room's exits when he entered it. But he was alive. And when Lottie came through the door of the room where he had been kept, he stood up from the chair so fast it fell backward, and the sound he made, something between her name and a sharp exhale, was the first thing in days that had made her feel the full weight of everything at once. She held herself together. She held him instead, which was easier. He was 20 years old and taller than she remembered, and he smelled of stale wool and someone else's soap, and underneath it, still, faintly, the particular scent that had meant brother to her since she was 9 years old, and he was 6, and their mother had placed him in her arms and said, "You will look after each other." She had not looked after him well enough. She was going to fix that. "You came," he said against her hair. "I should have come sooner," she said. "I didn't know sooner." He pulled back and looked at her face. His eyes moved over her the way she had moved over him, cataloging, checking, measuring the distance between who she had been and who she was now. His gaze went past her to the doorway, where Leander stood with 2 of his riders, and the wariness sharpened into something more specific. "Who is that?" Cale said, not quietly enough. "Someone who helped me find you." Cale looked at Leander with the flat, assessing suspicion of a young man who had spent 8 months learning that powerful people who appeared helpful were rarely operating without an agenda. Lottie understood it completely. She had been doing the same thing for 4 days. Leander met Cale's gaze without reaction. He did not step forward, did not offer a hand, did not perform any of the gestures that would have required Cale to immediately calibrate a social response. He simply acknowledged the look and waited. After a moment, Cale looked back at Lottie. "Marin," he said, one word, "carrying everything." "Yes," she said, "all of it. We are dealing with it." They traveled back toward Ashford territory over 2 days, and during those 2 days Lottie sat with the documents. Leander's investigation had produced 3 bound folios of material. Copied records, witness accounts from 2 pack members who had been quietly approached over the preceding months, the original land transfer paperwork with her father's signature, and beside it, the second set of documents that had never been shown to him. Side by side, the difference was visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The second set used the same notary seal as the first, but the seal impression was fractionally deeper, applied with a different weight of hand. Forged, carefully, but forged. Lottie sat in the traveling carriage across from Essa and read every page. She read them twice. She noted the dates, the names of the council members who appeared as witnesses, the specific language that transformed a security provision into an inheritance transfer. She noted the clause that removed pack protection from an unmated female heir past her 24th year. She noted the addendum, in a different hand, that named Cale as a dependent minor, to be managed at Marin's discretion until his majority, an addendum that had apparently been added after her father's signature was already on the page. By the end of the second reading, she had a precise, detailed map of what had been done, and in what order and by whose hand. She was not shaking. The thing in her blood had continued to slow under the camp healer's treatment. A woman named Bryn, careful and thorough, who had identified the compound in Lottie's system as a slow-acting nerve deteriorant, extractable, but requiring time. Bryn had told her plainly what it would have done if she had continued taking it uninterrupted. Lottie had listened, thanked her, and spent approximately 10 minutes alone before deciding that she did not have the luxury of being destroyed by that information right now, and that she could be destroyed by it later, when Marin was no longer in a position to follow through. On the evening of the second day, Leander came to the carriage. He knocked at the frame. The carriage was stopped for the night camp, and waited until she said to come in before entering, which she noted and filed beside all the other things she was cataloging about him. He sat across from her, and looked at the documents spread between them and then looked at her face. "You have been at those for 6 hours," he said. "I know them now," she said. "I know every name, every date, every inconsistency. When I stand before the council, I will not be a woman making accusations. I will be a witness who can demonstrate precisely what happened and in what sequence." He was quiet for a moment. "The council hearing is in 3 days." "I know. Marin will have legal representation. The council members who cooperated with her will attempt to minimize their involvement." "I know that too." He looked at her with that steady quality that she had stopped finding unsettling somewhere around the second day, and had started finding, instead, like a fixed point, something that did not move when everything else was moving. "Are you prepared for it to be public?" She thought about that honestly. The hearing would be before Lord Gregor's full council, which meant witnessed, recorded, and discussed in every pack hall within 50 miles before the week was out. It meant her name attached permanently to the story. The woman poisoned at her own mating ceremony. The woman whose stepmother had tried to erase her. There was a version of her that wanted to handle it quietly, to take back the land and find Maren gone and never speak of it again. But there was also the woman who had died. One of the 3 Leander had confirmed, an unmated female from the neighboring territory. Property transferred. Cause of death recorded as fever. Yes, Lottie said. It needs to be public. Not for me. For the ones who didn't make it out of the ceremony in time. He looked at her for a long moment. You are, he said carefully. Not what I expected either. She looked up from the documents. It was the first time he had offered anything that was not strictly practical, and the quality of it, mirroring her own words from 2 mornings ago, returning them to her gently, landed somewhere behind her sternum in a way she was not entirely prepared for. She looked back down at the papers. Don't, she said quietly. Don't what? Don't be... She stopped. She did not have the right word. She did not have the right word because the right word was kind, and she had been managing without kindness for long enough that receiving it now felt dangerous. Like warmth on frostbitten skin, like it could hurt more than the cold had. Leander said nothing. He did not push, did not ask her to explain, did not fill the silence with reassurance she hadn't requested. He simply sat, and the fire from the camp outside threw light through the carriage window in a slow, orange pulse. And after a while, Lottie's shoulders came down from where they had been held, somewhere near her ears, without her entirely deciding to let them. The mate bond, she said eventually. It had been sitting between them for 4 days, like a stone neither of them had stepped over. She had known since the first night, since the way he had looked at her on the dark road, since the brazier, since the quality of his attention that was not like other men's attention. Her peculiar senses had told her, and she had been ignoring it with the same disciplined focus she had applied to the documents. He did not pretend not to know what she meant. Yes. I am not. She pressed her lips together, tried again. I cannot. Another stop. She looked at her hands on the papers. Every person I trusted at that ceremony was either complicit or absent. The last man who told me he would find me first spent the ceremony with his hands on another woman's face. She looked up. I understand what a mate bond means. I understand it is supposed to be something different. But you should know that the word mate is currently contaminated for me by everything I thought it meant and everything it turned out to mean in practice. Leander listened to all of it without interruption. I know, he said. You know. I knew it on the road. Something in his expression was careful and deliberate and entirely honest. I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you, because you deserve to have the information, not because I expect it to change your position immediately, that the bond exists. What you do with that is yours to decide. She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. He did not soften the statement with a smile or harden it with expectation. He simply held her gaze and waited, in the way she had noticed he was extraordinarily capable of, waiting without pressure, without performance, as though her answer, whatever it was, would be accepted as the correct one. All right, she said finally. All right, he repeated. They returned to the documents. The council hearing lasted 4 hours. Lottie stood before Lord Gregor's full assembly and spoke for most of them. She laid the documents on the council table in sequence. She walked through the dates, the forged seals, the addendum added after signature, the financial arrangement between Maren and Lord Ashvane, the names of the 2 council members who had facilitated the documentation. She cited the precedent cases from neighboring territories. She named the woman who had died. Maren sat across the table in a gray dress and said nothing for the first 2 hours. Her representation offered challenges that Lottie answered from memory, from the 6 hours she had spent with the documents and the 2 days she had spent building the case in her head. Each challenge was met. Each inconsistency she had noted was already answered before it was raised. In the 3rd hour, one of the council members who had cooperated with Maren began to distance himself publicly. By the 4th, the 2nd had followed. Maren's composure lasted until Cale walked in. She had not known he was free. That had been deliberate. Leander's suggestion, and a good one. The moment Cale entered and took his place beside Lottie, something moved across Maren's face that was the first genuine thing Lottie had ever seen there. It was not remorse. It was the specific, stripped expression of someone who has watched their careful construction come apart and knows now that there is nothing left to manage. Lord Gregor rendered judgment before evening. The land transfers were voided. The documentation was corrected. The 2 council members were removed from their positions and their own properties placed under review. Lord Ashvane's financial arrangement was declared fraudulent. Maren was stripped of her pax standing, her right to the property, and her right to remain in Ashford territory. Lottie's father sat in the back of the council chamber throughout. She had known he was there. She had not looked at him directly until the end, when the judgment was finished and the room was beginning to empty. And she turned and found him standing, older than she had let herself remember him being, with an expression on his face that she did not know how to read and was not yet ready to try. He took 1 step toward her and stopped. She looked at him for a moment, long enough to see that he was not the man she had needed him to be, long enough to understand that he was also not entirely the enemy, that he had been shaped, managed, gradually removed from his own judgment by a woman who had been very patient and very skilled, and that this did not excuse him, but it did explain him. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was rough. "I know you didn't," she said. "Lottie." "Not today," she said, not unkindly, but firmly. "Not today." She walked out of the council chamber into the corridor, where Cale was waiting, and behind him, slightly apart, Leander, standing with his riders, having said nothing during the entire proceeding except to confirm the documentation's provenance when asked, having given her the floor and stayed out of it as completely as he had promised. She stopped in front of him. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her with the same steadiness he always had, the quality that she had finally stopped cataloging and started simply receiving. "You did that," he said. "I provided the room. You provided considerably more than the room." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite the almost smile, but something warmer than she had seen from him before. Something less contained. Outside, the late afternoon light was thin and silver. The kind of light that came at the end of hard days and meant, not happiness exactly, but the particular relief of a thing finished. Lottie stood in it and breathed. Winter came to Ashford territory the way it always did, without apology, overnight, the world gone white between one morning and the next. Lottie stood at the window of the room she had been given in Leander's northern residence and watched the first snow settle over the courtyard below. It was a serious house, stone walls, high ceilings, corridors that smelled of beeswax and old wood and the particular mineral cold of buildings that had stood for centuries. Not a castle in the theatrical sense, but something older and more permanent than that. A seat of actual power, rather than displayed power, which she had come to understand was entirely consistent with the man who owned it. 3 weeks had passed since the council hearing. In those 3 weeks, the voided land transfers had been formally restored to her name and Cale's. Lord Ashvani had appeared before a regional tribunal and been found liable for unlawful detention. His financial arrangement with Maren declared criminal. The 2 former council members were under ongoing review. Maren had left Ashford territory on the morning after judgment, escorted to the border by 2 of Leander's riders, and had not been heard from since, which Lottie found neither satisfying nor troubling. Maren was gone. The architecture of what she had built was dismantled. The woman herself was simply somewhere else, diminished, and that was enough. Bryn had cleared Lottie's bloodstream of the nerve deteriorant entirely by the end of the 2nd week. The process had been unpleasant, 3 days of fever and sharp, bone-deep aching, while her body finished expelling what had been accumulating for months, possibly longer than she had initially understood. She had been ill enough, briefly, that she had been confined to bed, and she had been aware during those 3 days of Essa moving through the room with the quiet efficiency of someone under specific instruction, and of the door being opened periodically and then closed again, and of a presence in the corridor outside that was not Essa and was not Cale, and that she was too exhausted to address directly. On the 3rd day, when the fever broke, she had woken to find a cup of the ginger and pepper preparation on the bedside table, still warm. She had not asked who had brought it. She had drunk it, and felt the warmth move through her, and looked at the ceiling for a long time before deciding she was well enough to sit up. Cale had adjusted to the northern residence with the particular adaptability of someone who had spent 8 months in forced simplicity and found ordinary comfort almost excessive by comparison. He ate well, slept long, and spent his days either in the library, which was extensive, or in the training yard with Leander's guards, rebuilding the physical confidence that months of confinement had eroded. He was wary around Leander still, in the careful way of someone who had learned that wariness was the correct default. But Lottie had noticed the wariness becoming more specific, less generalized suspicion, and more the particular attention of someone deciding whether a person was trustworthy on individual evidence rather than category. She recognized the process. She was doing it herself. Her father had sent 2 letters. She had read both. She had not yet replied to either, and she did not yet know whether she would, not because she had decided against it, but because she was still determining what she was willing to say and what she was willing to receive. And she did not want to write something from the ragged edge of the feeling rather than the center of it. Her mother had taught her that. Say the hard things from the quiet place, she had said, not from the storm. Lottie was still finding the quiet place on that particular subject. She was giving herself permission to take time. She found Leander in the library that evening. He was at the large table near the east window, reading by lamplight, and he looked up when she came in without surprise. She had noticed that about him, the complete absence of the performative startle that most people deployed to signal they had not been expecting you. He simply looked up and waited. She sat in the chair across from him. For a moment they said nothing. The fire worked steadily in the grate. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the night was very clear, the kind of clear that came after snowfall. The world muffled and new and lit from below by its own white surface. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The night on the road." She looked at him directly. "You said you knew about Marin's activities. You said her name appeared in the documents twice. But you also said you did not know about me specifically." She paused. "What did you know? When you stopped the horse, what were you actually responding to?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasively. She had learned to read the difference between his silences by now. This was the quiet of someone deciding on precision. "I had ridden past the ceremony ground," he said. "I knew the timing. I knew what the ceremony meant for a woman in Marin's household, that it was the last point at which intervention was possible before the protection clause expired." He looked at the lamp flame for a moment, then back at her. "And then I came around the bend, and there was a woman in a white dress standing in a hedge in the dark, and every instinct I have told me she was the one I had been too slow to reach." Lottie held his gaze. "Instinct," she said. "And the bond," he said, with the same directness he had used 3 weeks ago in the carriage. "Both at once. I could not have separated them if I tried." She thought about that. She thought about standing in that hedge, cold and unsteady and holding the shape of a disaster she had only just understood the edges of, and a man on a large horse stopping. Not because she had called out, not because she had done anything to be noticed, but because something in him had recognized something in her before she had said a single word. She thought about what it would have meant to her 3 months ago, to be told that a mate bond worked that way, like a compass finding north, like a recognition that preceded all the reasons for it. 3 months ago, she would have held it the way she had held Edmund's promises, like something fragile, like something she needed to be careful with. She did not feel that way now. She felt, instead, the particular clarity of someone who had been through enough to know the difference between a thing that was true and a thing that was merely wanted. "I have been thinking about what you said," she said, in the carriage, "that what I do with the bond is mine to decide." "Yes. I want to tell you what I have decided." He waited. He was very still. "I am not ready to be someone's mate in the way that word was used before all of this," she said carefully. "I am not ready for it to mean what it meant in that ceremony ground. Performance, arrangement, a woman placed at the edge of a firelight, waiting for a man who already chose someone else." She paused. "But I think I am ready for it to mean something different, something that starts from here, from what actually happened, from who we actually are." She looked at him. "If you are willing to let it be that." Leander looked at her for a long moment. The fire moved. The snow outside sat still and white and clean over everything. "I have been willing since the road," he said. "I have simply been waiting for you to be ready." "I know," she said. "That is part of why I am ready." He reached across the table, not to take her hand, not yet. He simply placed his hand on the table between them, open, an offer without urgency, a presence without demand. She looked at it for a moment, then she placed her hand over his. The bond moved through her like something that had been waiting very patiently at a door, Not forcing, not flooding, just stepping through now that the door was open. Warm. Certain. The particular quality of something that had always been true, becoming, finally, acknowledged. She did not cry, but it was close. They were bonded formally in the early spring, when the ground had softened, and the courtyard of the northern residence was beginning to show the first green at the base of the stone walls. It was not a ceremony like the Ashford ceremony. There were no torches arranged for spectacle, no crowd organized to witness, no performance of selection. It was a small gathering of people who had actually been present for what mattered. Essa, who had tended Lottie without question through the worst of it. Bryn, who had cleared her blood. The scarred rider, whose name was Devon, and who turned out to be Leander's oldest companion, and who cried briefly and without embarrassment during the formal words. Cale, who stood at Lottie's side, and who had shaken Leander's hand the week before with the deliberate gravity of a young man deciding to mean it. Lord Gregor sent a formal letter of recognition. The two neighboring pack alphas, whose territories had been affected by Marin's operations, sent representatives. The letter from her father arrived the morning of the ceremony. Not a request to attend, he had not presumed that, but something quieter. An acknowledgement. An apology that was careful and plainly written and did not ask her for anything in return. She read it twice. She folded it and placed it in the small box she kept in her room. The same box that held her mother's dried lavender, crumbled now to almost nothing, still faintly there. She would write back. Not today, but she would. There were things that did not resolve cleanly, and Lottie was old enough, and had been through enough, to know that clean resolution was not the same as true resolution. The woman who had died, the one from the neighboring territory, the one Marin's operation had reached before Leander's investigation had, was named Sarah. Lottie had learned that in the documents. She had asked Bryn what she knew, and Bryn had told her plainly, 26 years old, unmated, a mill property on the eastern border, fever, the record said, 8 months from the first document to the last. Lottie had gone to the grave before the bonding ceremony. It was a half-day's ride and she had gone alone, which Leander had not argued against, only ensuring 2 riders waited at the road's edge. She had stood at the grave marker, plain stone, the name cut shallow, and had not said anything particularly meaningful because she did not believe in performing grief for an audience even when the audience was only herself and the trees. She had stood there for a while. She had let herself feel the full weight of the luck that had placed her on that road, in that hedge, on the right night. The weight of the things that had not gone differently, only by the narrowest of margins. Then she had ridden back. She had spoken to Leander that evening about establishing a formal provision within his territorial jurisdiction, a mechanism for identifying women at risk of the specific legal vulnerability that Marin had exploited. A protection clause review, a way to flag documentation irregularities before they became disasters. He had listened, had asked 3 precise questions, and had said yes. Draw up what you think it needs. She was drawing it up. In the end, this was what Lottie understood about the shape of her own story. She had sat alone at the edge of a torchlit ceremony in a white dress, waiting for a man who had already chosen someone else, carrying a slow poison she hadn't known was in her blood, with a brother she thought was simply gone, and a stepmother she had spent years trying to earn something from that was never going to come. She had walked out of that ceremony ground on unsteady legs with no plan and no destination, which was the best decision she had ever made. She had been found, or had found. She was no longer certain which direction the finding had moved. A man who had stopped his horse in the dark and looked at her like someone who already knew the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet, who had given her warmth without conditions, information without softening, space without absence, presence without suffocation, who had handed her the documents and the room and the authority and the choice, and had waited. She was Luna of the Northern Territories now. That was the formal title. She did not find it strange in the way she had expected to. She found it, instead, like a coat that had been made for her actual measurements, not the measurements of who she had been told to be or who she had been trying to shrink into for 23 years, but the exact dimensions of who she actually was. Cale was alive and safe, and taking his proper place in the restored inheritance. Her father was somewhere in the distance, becoming gradually more himself again, now that the architecture around him had been removed, and she was giving him time to find out whether there was enough left of the original man to build something from. Maren was gone, reduced, stripped, somewhere without a pack's protection, which was precisely the condition she had tried to engineer for Lottie. Lottie did not find this poetic. She found it simply just. On the first warm evening of spring, she sat on the low stone wall outside the northern residence with Leander beside her and watched the light leave the sky in slow, unhurried stages, gold to amber to the particular deep blue that came just before dark. His shoulder was warm against hers. Below them, in the courtyard, Cale was arguing cheerfully with Devon about something she could not hear clearly, and did not need to. "Are you well?" Leander asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to do, not the automatic fine that had served as armor for years, but the actual answer. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and she had decided to say true things from the quiet place, "I think I have been well for a while now. I have just been getting used to it." He looked at her with that quality she had stopped trying to catalog and simply lived inside now. Steady, certain, carrying the particular warmth of someone who knew exactly where they were and had no intention of being anywhere else. He took her hand. Outside, the last of the light went from gold to nothing, and the first stars came through, and the courtyard below them was lit by torches that smelled of pine resin and beeswax, and somewhere inside the house, Essa was calling Cale in for supper, in the tone that meant she would not ask twice, and the stone wall was cold beneath them, and it did not matter because they were warm. Lottie held his hand and watched the stars arrive, one by one, and felt, completely, finally, without reservation, that she was exactly where she had always been meant to land. Maren was formally declared an exile of the Northern Pack territories the following autumn. She never returned. The protection provision Lottie drafted became law within 2 years, adopted by 4 neighboring packs. It bore no name, at her insistence. She said the work was the point, not the credit. Cale took his seat on the restored family land the following spring. He was, by all accounts, a fair and careful steward. He visited the northern residence every winter without fail, and he and Devon remained, improbably and permanently, friends. Lottie's father wrote to her every month. She wrote back. Leander never stopped looking at her the way he had on the road, like someone who had found the thing he had not known he was looking for, and intended to be worthy of having found it. Some things, once chosen clearly and completely, do not need to be chosen again. They simply become the shape of everything after.